Welcome back. This is the SQLDataSource data binding in ASP.NET. Our objectives for this session are as follows: understanding data binding, understanding the SQL data source, using parameterized commands with the SQL data source, and handling extra options and list controls using the SQL data source. What is data binding? Data binding is the process of binding a specific data to a control so that when the page is displayed, the data shows up. Let's say on a web page we have a text box. The primary aim for us to have a text box is to capture user input. Now, let us say we have a case wherein we want to fetch some data already in the database and show it to the user. This is where data binding comes into play. Data binding acts as a bridge, fetching the data from the database or any data source. Not only a database, could be any data source, and binds it to the control so that when the page is displayed, the data shows up on the control. We have the following types of binding: single value binding and repeated value binding. We use single value binding with those controls that can display only a single value at a time. Examples are the text box, the labels, and other controls. We use repeated value binding with those controls that display a set of items. Examples are list controls, grid views, etc. To use single value binding, all we need to do is on the ASPX markup page, we have to specify the tag with the delimiters %, and %. In between these delimiters come the data binding expression. For example, let us say we have a label, and on the label we want to display the current date and time. So what we do is we specify the text for this label as a data binding expression. Now, this data binding expression is the data source for this label, for this control. In this example, we have the method getCurrentDateTime as the data source for this label. This data source is bind to the control using the expression with the delimiters %, and %. Now, when the page is evaluated and executed, this particular method is executed. The value from this method is fetched and displayed on the label. Now, for this label to display the time properly, we need to have this method getCurrentDateTime defined in the corresponding ASPX.cs page. Not only a method, even a property could be a data source for a control using the single value binding. In this case, we specify just the name of the property using the data binding expression %, property name, %. Here is the implementation for the method getCurrentDateTime, which will return a string. The app name is also a property which returns a string. This way, the string data is associated with the two labels. The getCurrentDateTime method is the data source for the first label, and the app name property is the data source for the second label. So this is how we specified single value binding in controls using the delimiter %, and % in the ASPX markup page. For the page to evaluate the expression, run the corresponding code and assign the proper value, we need to call data bind on the page.load So don't forget to call the this.dataBind on the page.load event if you are going to have single value bindings. Repeated value bindings. Repeated value binding allow us to add a data collection to a control. Repeated value binding is for those controls that display a choice to the user, like list boxes, drop-down list, etc. Let us assume we have a control called courses that will contain a list of courses available to the student. Here is how we populate the list box with the available courses from the database. First, we define the list box, ASP list box, run at =server. We specify an ID and we specify a data text field and a data value field. Then on the page load event, if it is not a post back, we create a connection from a connection string and create a command from a SQL. The SQL for us is select ID, course from courses. The assumption here is we have a table called courses and we are selecting the ID and the course columns from this table. We execute the command and we get back a SQL reader. Now this SQL reader can become the data source for the list box. We specify lsdcourses.dataSource equal to reader and we do lsdcourses.databind. Now when the page is loaded, this particular code gets executed, the connection is made to the database, the command is executed, and the ID and the course are fetched from the courses table and attached to the control. So on the page we see the list box pre-filled with the courses. Introducing the SQL data source or the SQL data source. The SQL data source will represent a database connection and will use a ADO.NET provider. The following are the ADO.NET providers available right now: the SQL client, the Oracle client, the OLEDB, and the ODBC. Remember, the ADO.NET provider is a specialized type of client for a specific database. We have a SQL client for the Microsoft SQL Server databases, Oracle client for the Oracle databases, and OLEDB and ODBC for the other generalized types of data access. To use SQL data source in our application, we need to provide the following: a provider name, a connection string, and a query which will get executed. For example, here we specify a SQL data source definition: ID equal to source student names. ID should be unique within the page, and the connection string is specified to be the student db con str, which is a entry in the connection strings that are defined in the web.config file. So the point to remember here is it is possible for us to refer to a connection string already defined in the web.config file. How we do it is, from the connection strings array we specify the identifier for our specific connection string. Remember, in the web.config we can define multiple connection strings. Each connection string represents a connection to a specific database. We can use that connection string definition from the web.config in the SQL data source definition. The provider name here is SQL client. The assumption here is we are used connecting to a SQL Server database. We have a select command as select name from student. This is a simple definition of a SQL data source. Now, when the data source has been defined, we can bind the controls at runtime. To bind a control to the data source, we use the attribute data source ID. The data text field is the field in the table that is used to populate the control. Here in this example, we have a drop-down list called DDL names, and the data source ID is equal to the name, the ID of the SQL data source which we defined in the previous step. The data text field is name. Remember, we selected the name from the table. Select name from student. This name is the data text field. This is how we bind a control to the SQL data source. So at runtime, what will happen is this particular drop-down list called DDL names will be pre-populated with the names of the students from the database. Let us look at a sample web application that uses SQL data source. Please download the source code from the portal as a zip archive and extract it to the local folder. Now using Visual Web Developer, from the File Open Website menu, specify the top level folder to which you extracted the downloaded source archive. Select default.aspx from the Solution Explorer and click the Run button. There are some assumptions we have made here. There is a local database called StudentDB and has a table called Student with the following columns: ID, name and admission number. ID is the primary key identity column which is auto-generated. So let us take a pause here and look at the schema definition. Please ensure this particular schema is executed against your SQL Server database on your local. The schema.sql file is given as a download for your reference. Here we create this, if it's already not created, we created a database called StudentDB, and then inside StudentDB we create a table called Student with the columns ID, name, admission number and course. Okay, so let me open Visual Web Developer, use File, Open Website and select the top level folder from where I extracted the downloaded archive, source archive. I click on Open. I select default.aspx and click on the Run button. What it will do is it will load the page default.aspx on my default web browser. Okay, so when the page loads, whatever data is there in the database is displayed in a grid format. This is the very first thing you will notice when the page loads. We have ID, name and admission number from the from the student table. Okay, and we have the following rows. We have the following rows. Using this grid view, we can do an edit, delete or a select. Let me do a select. When do a select, this selected record, Harry Potter, is displayed in a details view for me. Okay, I can change selection. When I click on the second record, the details view changes to Ron, and then I can do it for the third record, Hermione. If I want to delete a record, I click on the delete button. I click on the delete button. For delete this row, I click on the delete button again. Now notice here it did not ask me for any confirmation. How to prompt the user for a confirmation we would see in the subsequent lessons. But for now, from a grid view using a SQL data source, it is possible for us to do an edit or a delete operation. Let me edit the first row. I can edit the ID also. Ideally this should not be allowed. We will see how to prevent this in the next lesson. For now, let me change only the admission number. Let me change it to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Notice here when I click on the edit, when the row changes to edit mode, the operations change from edit, delete and select to update and cancel. Now only I have two options, either I can cancel it or I can do an update. When I do an edit operation, the available operations change to only update and cancel. So let me change the admission number to 5, 6 and then say update. So this changes to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the database as well. Okay. If we want to add a new student, I use the details view and I click on the new button here. So this allows me to add new students. Remember, the ID is also allowed for editing, which should have been prevented. We will see how to do this in the subsequent classes. For this lesson, we will focus only on the SQL data source. We do not want to lose our focus on understanding the SQL data source, so I have moved the validation part away for now. Okay, so hold on, don't worry, we will look at it in the next class when we look at rich data controls. Okay, let me specify the name and then admission number as say 111. I click on insert. Here the record got inserted, right? If I select this record, it gets loaded in the details view. The details view, which allows me to add new records, has some pagination. I can look at the different records by click on the particular number here. There are 4 elements, there are 4 students. The first is Harry Potter, the second is Ron, third is Hermione, and the fourth is currently me. Okay, so this is a simple example using the SQL data source. Let us look at the code to understand how these things work. So here we are at the default.aspx page. First and foremost is the SQL data source definition we have. We have a SQL data source. The ID is called data source student. This ID needs to be unique across this page. We cannot have 2 SQL data sources having the same name. Then we specify the connection string. The connection string is the connection string called studentDB connection strings from the array defined in the web.config. If you go to a web.config file, you would notice that we have connection strings element which defines 2 different connection strings for us. One called application services and the other called studentDB connection string. So we are going to use the connection string with the name studentDB connection string. That is what we specify in the connection string property here. And then since we will be using this to populate a grid view, we would say data source mode equal to data set. Okay. And then there are some commands, the select command, insert, update and delete command. Okay. For the select command we say select ID, name, admission number from student. Okay. So this data source is used in the grid view. This is the main grid view here. Okay. Here what we do is our data source ID for this grid view is data source student, which we saw here, data source student. So the select command is select ID, name, admission number from student, and that is why we saw the rows from the table already filled for us. Okay. And then we want to see 3 particular columns, the ID, the name and the admission number. We specify them using the columns definition. Okay. So ID refers to the ID is shown under ID, the name is shown under name, and admission number, this is the column name, is shown under admission space number. So this is how we can customize the view so that we can have a more meaningful name for the header. There need not be a one-to-one mapping between whatever is the column name should definitely be the header name. It is not like that. You can have a column name and have an altogether different header name. Okay, so we had a auto generate edit button, we had a delete button, and we also had a select button. Okay, when the select button was clicked, we wanted to change the view in the corresponding details view. Okay, for that what we did is, this is the details view, and the details view has a data source ID called data source student details. Remember, the main grid and the second details view are totally have 2 different data sources. This is the first main grid, ID, name, admission number. Notice the admission number which has a space here, and it is number, not NO, right? And then when we do a select here, there's a particular details view which comes into play, right? Okay, this grid and this grid view and this details view have a different data source. The grid view has the data source ID, data source student, and the details view has the data source ID, data source student details. Let us look at data source student details. The data source student details is again another SQL data source. Connection string is the same studentDB connection string. The select command is select ID, name, admission number from student. There is a where clause here. Notice the where clause, where ID equal to @ID. And we have some select parameters. Okay, the ID value comes from the query string called ID. Okay, so as the query string changes, the data source will change. When the query string is 1, it will fetch Harry. When the query string is 2, it would fetch Ron. And when the query string ID value is 3, it would fetch Hermione. So how do we change the query strings? Let us go back to the main grid view. Remember, we have a method called onSelectIndexChanging. This property has a corresponding event handler called studentGridView SelectIndexChanging. So let us look at this method, SelectIndexChanging. So this is the method studentGridView SelectIndexChanging. What we do here is the selected row, we get the selected grid view row, okay, and then the first cell is the ID, right? The very first cell is the ID, right? We get the ID here as a student ID, and then we form the URL. We say default.aspx and ID equal to 1. And then we do a response.redirect so that the page is reloaded one more time. So what happens is, as the index changes, as we click on different rows, each time we click on different row, we do a select. Each time we do a select here, we click on a select here. Each time a select happens, this particular event handler gets fired, and the corresponding rows student ID is selected, and it is appended to the query string ID equal to some value, either 1, 2, 3 or something else, which corresponds to the ID of the student record, and then the whole page is loaded one more time. So when the whole page is loaded one more time with the query string, this particular parameter is passed to this ID, and that is how the grid this particular data source selects that row which is selected from the main grid view. So let us run this in one more time. Okay, I do a select Hermione comes up here. I select Ron comes. So what happens? Whenever I click on select, this event handler gets fired. The corresponding ID is fetched, either 1, 2, 3, depending on the row where the select is clicked, and then the query string is formed, ID equal to 1, 2 or 3, and then the whole page is submitted one more time. So when this submission happens again, this particular data source is executed, the select command is executed with the ID from the query string, and that is how we get the details. Okay, so hope this is very clear. When you do a select, we execute an event handler which gets the selected row and fetches the ID using the cells of 1, and that ID, student ID, is appended to a query string ID equal to student ID, and then the page is submit one more time, which causes this particular data source to have a different value each time the select is clicked. And that is how the value changes in the particular details view. So what we have seen now is how to do a parameterization of the SQL data source. We can have varied clauses, and the select parameter can be from either a query string or could be from a different control as well. Let's look here now. Let me say I want to choose Ron Weasley. Now what happens is this particular grid shows me Ron Weasley. If I want to choose Hermione, this particular grid shows me Hermione. So let us look how we do this. Go back to our ASPX page. Okay, so we have a drop down list called DDL names. Okay, DDL names has the data source as source student names, and the data text field is name. Okay, so source student names is here. Source student names, what it does is it selects only the name from the student table. Okay, that is how in the drop down list the names are already pre-filled for us. Whatever names exist in the database are pre-filled for us. Now the interesting thing here is when the drop down is selected, we want to change the grid called grid view 2. Okay, grid view 2 has a data source called source students from name. Source students from name definition is given here. In the source students from name, what we do is we come to the same database and then we select again name, admission number from student, but here instead of ID it is where name equal to at name. Previously it used to be where student equal to at ID. Now it is where name equal to at name. And the select parameters, the control parameter is another control called DDL names. Okay, from DDL names we select the name property, which is a selected value. So the selected value on this control gives us name, and it is this name which is substituted in the query to fetch the items for this particular data source. That is how changing the element in the drop down list changes the item which is displayed in the grid. As we select Harry, it is changed to Harry Potter. Let's change it to Ron. This changes to Ron. Okay, so far so good. So this drop down list shows all the names of the students from the database. Now let us say in the web user design, good UI design principles, whenever we have a drop down list, the first element should be select. Or let's say I want to have the facility to select all the students. Right now I can choose only one. I can choose only Hermione, or I can choose only Harry. Let's say I want to see all the students here. So I want to have an element in this list which says all students. When that is selected, it should show all the students in the grid. This is example of handling extra options in the select controls. Okay, so how do we do it? Here's how. Look at this drop down. In this drop down we have the 4 students, Harry, Ron, Hermione and myself, and there are 2 extra options. One called select student. When you click on this, nothing happens. When I click on all students, all the students get displayed here. When I click on Harry, only Harry gets displayed. When I click on select student, nothing is displayed. And when I click on all students again, I can see all the students. So in this drop down list we have two extra options and we have handled them in the grid view. How do we do that? Let's go back to our ASPX page and then we have students, a data source called source students name 2. Okay, and the command is select name from student. And the drop down list, when you define the drop down list, we specify the data text field and the data value field, but we do not specify the data source ID. Please notice this. For the drop down list, from where we added the extra options, we have not specified the data source ID. Now, in the grid, which is the source for the students, this is the last grid in the page, right? We have a data source definitions as follows. A connection string is student DB connection string, and we have ID, name, admission number from student, the name equal to @name, and the control parameter comes from the list LST name. Okay, so we have LST name, and this is the control which controls the parameters for the data source. We have data source 1 and data source 2, and the second data source, which is the data source for the grid, is controlled by the control called list name. Okay, and list name, for list name, remember we have not specified the data source yet. Okay, the most important thing for us is to look at the source student's name underscore selecting method. Let's look at default ASPX class. Okay, on the page load event, what you do is we create two new list items, select student and select all students, and we add them to LST name. Remember, LST name is the name of our drop down list. LST name is the name of drop down list. This is LST name. This one is LST name. Okay, and on this LST name control, we added two extra items, one called select student and the other called all students. Okay, now we also have a selecting event handler. In selecting event handler, what we do is we check the command parameter. If @name is null, we do nothing. If @name is equal to -1, we again do nothing. -1 corresponds to the selection all students. Okay, if the selection is -2, what you do is -2 corresponds to the selection all -1 corresponds to selection select student, and -2 corresponds to the selection all students. So if all students is selected, which is -2, we change the command from the select ID, name, admission number from student by name equal to @name. Instead of that, we just specify select ID, name, admission number from student, thereby selecting all the students. So whenever the selection is select all students, we change the command so that all the students get selected. That is how we handle extra options in the SQL data source. So very simple. This is how SQL data sources are used in an ASP.NET web application. Okay, so let's go back to our demo and the slides. Parameterized commands are used for master detail relationship. We can create a master detail form using parameterized commands. An example for a master detail command is this. This is the master. The first grid is the master and the second grid is the detail. I click on Harry, the detail changes. So again I click on Hermione, the detail changes. This is an example for a master detail relationship. The master detail relationship provides us an ability to retrieve data in one control based on a given set of data in another control. Thus we have two controls that are interrelated. To define a master detail relationship, we first need to define two data sources. In the example we saw, we had a source student's name and a source student's from name. Okay, and source student's from name had a select parameter, select ID, name, admission number from student, where name equal to @name, and @name was a selected value from the control called DDL names. This way we used to we defined a master detail relationship using a what you call a control parameter. So in this example, DDL names had the data source ID as source student names. This would make sure that when the DDL names is displayed to the user, all the names of the students in the database would be pre-filled, and source students from name would display only those student whose name was selected from the DDL names, because there was a where clause which says select ID, name, admission number from student where name equal to @name, and the parameter name, the control parameter name, came from the control called DDL names. We specify the control ID as DDL names. That is how DDL names, which is the drop down list, control the elements in the grid, in the grid view called grid view 2. This is a master detail relationship. We can also use the parameterized queries to define an insert, update and delete command. We just need to specify select command equal to select command, insert command equal to insert in student, and the @name and @admission number corresponds to the column definitions we did in the grid view. For example, if this is the data source is attached to a grid view, the @name and @admission number are defined as columns in the grid view. Similarly, we had an update command and a delete command. So this was our main grid view. The SQL data source for a grid view, main grid view, is insert command, update command and delete command. All had @name, @admission number and @id defined, right? These are used in the commands. Now in the main grid view, we define the fields ID, name and admission number. So this is how they get internally used in the parameterized queries. So once we define the select, insert, update, delete command, we can attach this data source to a grid view and then say auto generate columns equal to false, and we can add edit button, delete button or select button by setting the value to true, and define the columns with the data field attribute. Defining the columns with the data field attribute gives us the flexibility to change the header text to whatever we want. The good thing about using a data source mode property with the value as data set is that the data set object is stored in memory, and when we use the grid view, this allows us to sort the grid view and to use pagination on the grid view. We will see how to sort the grid view and pagination properties functions when you look at rich data controls. But for now, Keep in mind, it is good to use the data source mode equal to data set only in a grid view. Okay, so how do we handle extra options in the SQL data source? First and foremost, define the data source for the list. We need to have a list, right? So we specify the data source for the list. Select name from student is the select command. Then define the markup for the list. LST name, and we specify the data text field as name. Remember, we do not specify the data source ID, not yet. Now, define the SQL data source that will be used by the grid control to display values. Ultimately, we are defining a master detail relationship. The control parameter is LST name, and the property is the selected value, which is the name. So, whatever control uses this data source will show the results of the query. ID, select ID, name, admission number from student, where name equal to @name, and this name comes from the drop down list. Now on the page load event, we add 2 extra items to the list. The one list item is called select student and has the selected value is -1, and the second item is called all students and has a selected value as -2. These two items are inserted in the control called LST name, one after the other. Now we need to have a event handler when the student source from names is selected. What we do is we look at the command parameter. If the command parameter name is null, we do nothing. If the command parameter name is select student, the selected value will be -1. Again, we do nothing. We cancel the current operation. And if the command parameter name is all students, the selected value will be -2. We change the command from select ID name admission number from student, where name equal to @name, to select ID name admission number from student, thereby selecting all the students. What we do ultimately is, when select student is selected, we cancel the command. When all student is selected, we change the query to get all the students. SQL data source has some disadvantages, but they are minor in nature. SQL data source is used heavily in ASP.NET web applications. They are very easy to get started and allow rapid application development. But one of the minor drawbacks are the data access logic becomes scattered in the ASPX page. Remember, the ASPX page was supposed to contain only markups and presentation logic. Now it contains data definitions as well. Having data access logic in multiple places makes it hard to maintain the code in large applications. These are some of the drawbacks of using SQL data sources. What we have seen so far: we saw how to do data value bindings, single value bindings, and repeat value bindings. We defined the SQL data source. We used parameterized commands and master details view using the SQL data source. We saw how to update and delete data using the SQL data source. And we also handled extra options and list controls using the SQL data source. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. We'll see you soon with object data sources.